arguably, time management is all that life is. And it's very true. I have a good friend who's in the hospital right now. He's been given 3 months. You and I don't know how long we have. He's got a much better sense of how much time he has, and it's devastating, right? I keep track of time because time is the most precious thing we have in our lives. I like to know how I'm spending my time, how I plan to spend my time. And so I'm planning and I can look at my intentions. And if I abandon an intention without a good reason and it's working against me, that's what I would say procrastination is. Forcing ourselves will only take us so far. It might help us get over the hump, but I think there's more important strategies that we can use than trying to just become more of a Arnold Schwarzenegger of willpower.
Hello, everyone. I'm Larry Weeks, and this is the Bounce Podcast. Let me start by paraphrasing Brené Brown from her book, The Gifts of Imperfection. We have to talk about why we let stuff get in the way of doing what is best for us. So this podcast is about procrastination. Now, it's a universal struggle. 1 minute you're ready to check off a well-thought-out to-do list, and the next you're knee-deep in cat videos on the internet that your spouse constantly sends you. Yeah, that's me. And before you judge me, you have to meet my cat. So distraction is not just something that interrupts us, wresting away our attention, but it can be something we seek out to force a delay. So why do we do that? My guest is Dr. Tim Pychyl. Tim is a retired psychology professor whose research focused on understanding why we can become our own worst enemy through procrastination. In addition to journal publications and co-edited scholarly books, including Procrastination, Health and Well-Being, Counseling the Procrastinator in Academic Settings, Tim wrote the brief and accessible Solving the Procrastination Puzzle, a concise guide to strategies for change, which is also the touchstone for our podcast. Tim is an award-winning teacher, and we talk about that, by the way. Tim has shared his passion for learning through iProcrastinate podcast and the blog In Psychology Today. And you can learn more about Tim and his work and his research at procrastination.ca. So on this episode, Dr. Pychyl defines procrastination and discusses why not every delay is procrastination. We talk about the impact procrastination has on our well-being. This isn't just a to-do list or project left undone issue. Procrastination affects the whole of your life. We talk about why we procrastinate, the real reason behind our delays. And then we talk about how to address the urge to procrastinate. We discuss present self versus future self, specifics on strategies to deal with procrastination, the importance of staying put, as it were, and what that means. And we talk about willpower. Is it a limited resource? We discuss the debate around ego depletion theory. We discuss what role motivation plays in our ability to overcome procrastination. And then we get into how Tim tackles his to-do list. So we discuss time boxing and other methods that he finds helpful. I want to leave you before I give you Tim is with this thought. And Tim and I were emailing back and forth after we recorded the podcast. And on one of his emails, he had a signature with the Latin expression, carpe diem quam minimum credulo postero. I'm probably butchering the Latin there, but you'll recognize that first part, and carpe diem, which most interpret as seize the day. But it is not the best translation. And when Tim left the whole aphorism in the signature line, you rarely see it. And the entire phrase is this: pluck the day, trusting as little as possible to the future. That's perfect for the podcast and for our discussion, because that's what procrastination is. We are putting a ton of trust in the future and a ton of pressure on the future self. So with that said, I give you Dr. Tim Pychyl. Tim, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. You've interviewed a lot of interesting people who I've listened to or I know.
Thank you for that. I'm sure you will be in good company here. Your book is very interesting. And so I'm looking at your bio and a ton of awards here, Tim. Graduate Mentoring Award and the inaugural recipient of the University Medal for Distinguished Teaching. And You also taught a doctoral seminar on university teaching, but I'm curious as to the skill set of teaching and what you would teach. Is it nerdy in the sense of crossing T's as to what a professor or someone who's teaching doctoral students, is it nerdy in that sense, or is it broader? Does it apply to any kind of teaching or training?
It's a good question. And it applies to everything. And there's little techniquey things like making sure everyone can hear you, having clear visuals, having a story, having set body closure. There's all sorts of techniques, and they're necessary, but far from sufficient. If I could only say there was one thing that you have to do as an effective teacher is to show up, right? Your whole person has to show up. You have to be there in earnest. You have to be vulnerable as a learner as well as a teacher. And when you do that with your whole being, it really is the thing that lights a fire for learning.
By the way, I found you on Sam Harris on the Waking Up app. How does that happen? Does Sam just reach out to you and say, "Hey, read your book. Could you do an app?" I'm just curious because I see a lot of authors that will come through the app that way.
Sam's team reached out to me.
Okay.
I have yet to speak with Sam directly. We may, in fact, have an interview or a conversation. We have to decide what we want to talk about. We don't want to just rehash the series, but his team just reached out to me, and it was kind of a cold call. So they said, "We don't know if you know what we do." I said, "I know what you do intimately. I've listened to every single episode of everything you've done."
Oh, that's cool that you have. Yeah, that must have been cool. Yeah.
And I'd listened to every single interview on Making Sense as well. I know Sam's work very well. So I was happy to be invited, particularly because I'm retired. And that's one of the reasons I was quick to say yes to you. I want to kind of park some of this knowledge, right? Like I'm not doing research anymore, although I can still review papers and things, but I want to share what I think I understand. And so that's the reason I was keen to do a series for Waking Up. Plus, I just think, well, as you'll hear perhaps as we talk, I think that so many of the skills that people need to develop to procrastinate less are things that are taught in Waking Up. And so for me, it was just this beautiful place to situate because I could say, so this is what I think procrastination is, and this is why. Here's the research. So these are the things you need to do. Now, I'm not a counselor or a teacher, a meditation teacher, but you don't have to go anywhere, but it's one click away.
So let's talk about procrastination. And is it an oversimplification just to say it's putting stuff off? I mean, is that it?
Yes. Yeah, it is an oversimplification. I know you've already, I looked through all the various people you interviewed, kind of get a feel for your podcast and who you are and your focus. And I really liked the focus around challenge. And I noticed that you've interviewed my colleague, Pierce Steele.
I was going to ask you if you and Pierce work together or.
Oh, we know each other quite well. Yes, okay, of course. Cool. And it's a small world, right? And he's also another Canadian. And back in 2007, just after he finished his own doctorate, he published a review article that's been well cited and read. And I defer to his definition. I think he came up with one of the best. I might be paraphrasing slightly, but it's probably close. Procrastination is the voluntary delay of an intended action, despite expecting to be worse off for the delay. So a lot of interesting things in there. I talk about it, as you heard in the Waking Up app. There's a voluntary delay of an intended action. So it's delay. Procrastination is a form of delay. And the key thing is that makes it irrational is that you're doing this recognizing that, I made an intention to do something now because all things considered, this was the best time to act. And I'm probably going to pay a price for not acting, but I'm going to delay. So that's the way to think of it. Now, a colleague and friend at Utrecht University in the Netherlands, Joel Anderson, philosopher, puts it even more succinctly. He says, procrastination is culpably unwarranted delay. And when I work with lawyers and judges, they particularly like that one, of course, culpable. Culpably unwarranted delay.
Unwarranted delay.
Yeah, and it captures it. It's not warranted. Like you and I could delay things. I could have delayed our conversation today. Perhaps I'd have a child that's ill or my car broke down. We might call these inevitable delays. And even when you sent me a reminder about the podcast, there's a reschedule or cancel button on there, right? And I might have had to reschedule, maybe even just purposely. Not that something had come up, but it just wasn't the ideal time. So there's purposeful, even sagacious delay. All things considered, I shouldn't do this now. I'm going to do something else instead. Inevitable delay. There's conflict between my roles in life. And there's even delay due to emotional problems. And I won't go there right now, but procrastination is a particular form of delay. It's self-defeating. It's a delay for which we're culpable.
So not all delay, because you just mentioned a few circumstances where things are delayed. It's not all delay is procrastinating. I'm just trying to figure out, sussing out what would qualify as procrastination. If it's an emotion-focused coping strategy, which I think that's the point of your book. Tell me what makes it procrastination.
Well, what makes it procrastination is that you're putting off an intended action without justifiable reason and knowing that it's not in your best interest. It has this notion of the Greek akrasia, is acratic action, that you're doing something against your own best interest. We're rational agents, we would like to argue. When there's limits to our rationality, we might talk about that. But I make an intention, and now the time comes for me to act on that intention, and I sing the procrastinator song. I don't want to. I don't feel like it. I'll feel more like it tomorrow. And that's why we're going to talk about it as an emotion-focused coping response. But if we just stick with what makes something procrastination, you're abandoning an intention without good reason. Like, I can update my intentions, right? There's nothing wrong with that. I very carefully track all my time. I know you had Oliver Burkeman on your podcast as well. And what a wonderful and interesting person. And he talks about the fact, and I quote him in that sense, that, arguably, time management is all that life is. And it's very true. I have a good friend who's in a hospital right now. He's been given 3 months. You and I don't know how long we have. He's got a much better sense of how much time he has, and it's devastating, right? I keep track of time because time is the most precious thing we have in our lives. I like to know how I'm spending my time, how I plan to spend my time. And so I'm planning, and I can look at my intentions. And if I abandon an intention without a good reason, and it's working against me, that's what I would say procrastination is. Now, if I look at that schedule and say, you know what? It's best I don't do this today. I need extra help, or I need some further information, or other things have to be aligned. I can make an intention update. Nothing wrong with that. And I hope that's a good distinction between procrastination, when I abandon an intention without it's unwarranted, as we talked about a moment ago, culpably unwarranted delay, versus I have a good reason and it makes sense and it probably will benefit me, not harm me. So that's how I would distinguish procrastination from other forms of delay.
I'm trying to come up with a trigger or some internal alarm that says you're procrastinating, for myself personally. I was thinking as I was preparing for the podcast, I'm like, how do I know if I'm overanalyzing or just doing some kind of analysis or procrastinating on something? And what came up for me was maybe some, not guilt, but some emotional tone that said, you should be doing this. You should be doing this right now. So is there anything like that, Tim, that would signal that, okay, you're procrastinating? Let me give you one more example, because I'm beating a dead horse, because I've been thinking about this. I'm putting on this adult prom thing, and there's this whole event thing that I've got in my head. Mm-hmm. I've been putting together pieces of a band and actors and everything that needs to go into this. I haven't pulled the trigger. I've got the venue gates. I've got everything. I haven't pulled the trigger. I haven't booked anything because I'm still not sure if I'm going to do this. So it's this gray area where, am I procrastinating or am I just am I still doing some analysis of, can I pull this together? I hope I'm making sense. Sorry.
You are making a lot of sense. And yet you've asked the most difficult of questions. I've been asked this before, particularly with high functioning individuals, like worked a lot with judges. And it comes down to, there's some personal wisdom here. There's no one signal that can do this for you. You use the example of, well, what about my emotions? Well, many of us are wound pretty tight. In personality psychology, we call this one of the big 5 personality traits of neuroticism, or lack of emotional stability. So just because I'm starting to get upset, it doesn't always just reflect the task and the situation I'm in, but it also reflects person. It's always person by situation. So that's why I would be cautious to say that I would rely only on my emotional response, because many of us run around the world with lots of shame and guilt, and not healthy. And it shouldn't be a signal about anything except the fact that we have some work to do. It requires some honest self-reflection to know the difference between, am I procrastinating, or is this a really wise delay that I don't want to be imprudent here? I don't want to be impulsive. I'm sure at some point peers probably talked about impulsivity and procrastination. If we're very impulsive, we can also be procrastinators. But if you're really impulsive, it can also lead to other kinds of problems too. And so you could pull the trigger on this big event and eat it, right? It may not be the best of plans. So how can I know the difference? How can I know the difference? Let's give another example where I say, I'm going to exercise more. And the best time of the day, it seems, is at the end of the day, at least in principle. And then the end of the day comes, and here I am, tired. I think, I don't want to exercise. I'm too tired tonight. So how do I know the difference between I'm truly too tired or I'm procrastinating? And so one of the ways to tell the difference is something that David Allen, famous, productivity guru, would say, let's do the 5-minute rule here. I'm going to exercise for 5 minutes. I'm just going to put the seat of my pants on the seat of my exercise bike, or get onto that elliptical and start moving my legs. And if 5 minutes from now, I really can't do it, then I'll say, okay, I'm too tired. But typically what happens, and this is how we're predictably irrational as human beings, is that I get onto that exercise bike reluctant to get on it. And 5 minutes later, I'm sure I'm going to be riding in the Tour de France next year because I'm just feeling so good. So a little tongue in cheek there, but it comes down to testing the waters a little bit to know the difference. And there's no way around some honest self-reflection and that word I used at the beginning, wisdom. There's a little bit of wisdom about knowing yourself well enough to say, I'm just avoiding again. This has all the taste and feel of avoidance versus, no, there's good reasons that I need to put this off. That's not going to be a satisfactory answer at some level. And that's why I've been most challenged when the judges would ask me that. But I have to admit that when I turn it around and talk about this, they understand that, because so many things in life require that wisdom, that discernment, right? It's not just a formula. There's no simple equation in life that when we plug in all the variables, we get the answer. Wouldn't that be nice if it was the case?
I want to kind of rub salt in the wound of procrastination here, in the sense that the to-do list and the project list is important. But you actually bring this around to our overall lives, which I hadn't really thought of before. I was just focused on kind of immediate things I want to get done, which are important. There's a quote in there where you say, when we learn to stop needless voluntary delay in our lives, we live more fully. So you say procrastination is failing to get on with life itself. And I hadn't thought about that. I thought about it in that way. And it also made me start thinking about bucket list. Some things started coming up. It's like, I think I may be procrastinating on some bucket list things that I need to reflect on. What am I failing to get on with life itself? They're not pressing. Nobody's going to hold me accountable for not doing them, but I will be accountable at the end of my life for not having done them. I hope I'm making sense.
Absolutely. You're always making sense. Let me reflect. Some of you reflected some of my writing back to me. Let me reflect a sentence back to you from your website. Being willing to face and work with obstacles is how you've grown personally and professionally, right? And really, in so many ways, when we come up face to face with something we want to avoid, and it can be something as mundane as keeping my dishes done, or it could be something as magnificent as something on your bucket list, right? Life is made up of both ends of that spectrum and everything in between. When we come up against that and we want to avoid it, it really is problematic, because we only get one chance at this, right? This is it. That's a wonderful expression. And this is our lives. It's not a dress rehearsal. So when we're not engaging in things that we say define us, and the things that we say we want to be, the goals that we want to accomplish, then that's deeply problematic. In fact, unlike Piers Steele, who actually did a doctoral dissertation on procrastination, I didn't come to that work as a graduate student. I was studying people's goal pursuit and its prediction of well-being. And it was through that I recognized that when our goals faltered, when we procrastinated, and people told me this in interviews as well as the quantitative data showing it as well, the more the procrastination loomed its head, the lower the well-being. And so that's why I turned a corner in my own research and said, yeah, I'm not so much interested in goal pursuit as much as it's interesting. I'm interested in that breakdown in goal pursuit. And then I take it a step further, as you noted, that I realize it's deeply existential. And you did that a moment ago when you talked about bucket list projects. I went to a conference. I'm not a clinician, but I went to a very clinically oriented conference on grieving. And because it was about meaning in life. And I think Viktor Frankl's son was at that conference. I remember going to hear him speak. And in fact, as an aside, we have done since then some research on meaning and procrastination. And not surprisingly, the lower one's meaning in life, the more procrastination. And I even worked with a Russian colleague and we demonstrated that across cultures. The point is that when I was at this conference, one of the presenters was talking about the regrets of those who are grieving. And just as you said a moment ago, I'll have to face myself and I'll really regret these things. And I pushed a little bit and said, well, what kind of regrets? And it was the things that we wanted to do with that other person while they were here and they're no longer here. So at that point, procrastination, it's clear how significant it is in our lives. But it's significant in the mundane ways as well. Like, it's not just in these bucket list projects, these magnificent pursuits in our lives, but in our day-to-day lives. Am I being the person that I want to be? Because to be that person takes action in the world. And the gap between intention and action is another way to define procrastination. Although all we did was add that gap has the extra flavor of, and I know this isn't my best interest. There can be a gap between intention and action for good reasons, for other reasons. But in the case of procrastination, it's like, I just don't want to do it. And why don't I want to do it? Well, from our research, what we saw is that we procrastinate on aversive tasks. And one of my students many years ago, Alan Blunt, did a wonderful study that's often cited because there's not enough work done on it. Well, what makes a task aversive, Al said. And so when he did some research, we learned that tasks that were defined as boring, tasks that we resented doing, that were frustrating to us, that causes anxiety, even fear, and you can name other negative emotions, lacking meaning, lacking structure. These are the tasks that we're most likely to push off, to avoid, because we're trying to avoid those negative emotions.
To your last point about aversive, what did you call it? Aversive task?
Yes, aversive.
There's a checklist or sheet that I got from David Burns, a pleasure prediction sheet I created, and it's a CBD technique, cognitive behavioral technique, where I think it's meant to get people active who are, because they're depressed or just not active. But I've used it in the past for procrastination. I forgot all about it till I was reviewing and prepping for the podcast. And I kind of renamed it a satisfaction prediction sheet and wanted to ask you how it's worked for me. I wanted to see what you thought about it and why it would work for someone like me or just work generally. It's basically listing the tasks that I'm putting off, and then I predict a satisfaction level of doing it. Like what do I feel like on a percentage of 1 to 100%, which is really enjoying it 100% or 0%. I hate it. So I list what I'm currently feeling about the task. So I predict that. And then I have another column where after I do the task, I put in a percentage of how much I enjoyed it or how much satisfaction I got out of it versus the prediction. And usually 9 times out of 10, the satisfaction level is much higher than the predict level, which tends to have me doubt myself when I'm predicting, I'm just going to hate doing this, right? So it takes a little of the sting out of the aversion to a task. Is there
I think it's clever.
Okay.
And I don't mean that in a trite way. I think it's nice to operationalize things as you did, where you can see differences.
Yes.
Having been a social scientist for so long, measuring things like that is always of interest. Back in the 90s, before students ran around campus with cell phones, I bought pagers to do an experience sampling study. They were They're used a lot now because we have the technologies to follow people more closely. But a pager was interesting. I paged students throughout the day, asked them, what are you doing? What do you think about it? How are you feeling? And I could do that throughout the day. And let's imagine on Monday, I ask, what are you doing? Hanging out at the coffee shop with my friends. How's that going? Oh, it's fun. Is there something else you should be doing? Oh, yeah. I should be doing my stats assignment. So what's that like? How fun is that? 0. How difficult? Oh, really difficult. How enjoyable? Oh, in the toilet. How stressful? Really high. And lo and behold, to make this long story short, later in the week, we finally page them when they're actually doing the stats assignment, because procrastinators typically get down to it just at the 11th hour or the 13th, as the case may be. And what we found is something similar, not exactly the way your numbers go, but that now there is a statistically significant difference between their enjoyment and their difficulty and stress ratings. When they envisioned it on Monday, it was more difficult and stressful than it actually was when they got to it. So again, we're seeing this discrepancy in our perception of the task before and when we're into it. And when we ask people to think out loud what they were feeling and put it into words on Monday, they said things like, I've got lots of time. I'll feel more like doing it tomorrow, or they diminish the task somewhat. It doesn't matter that much, reducing cognitive dissonance. Whereas the day they were doing it, no one spontaneously said things like, I'm glad I waited to the last minute because I work better under pressure. They said things like, what's wrong with me? This isn't as bad as I thought. Not for a moment do I want you to think that stats went from stressful, difficult to fun, but it wasn't the boogeyman that they made it out to be. Very much like your data, that your predicted satisfaction was higher when you actually finished it than what you perceived it would be. Now, another way
almost across the board, it was I never predicted correctly. I mean, there was an occasional it got close, but
yeah, well, there's something about finishing that also really boosts us up. If you listen to Andrew Huberman at all, he has the Huberman Lab podcast, and he's done an interesting episode on dopamine and procrastination and dopamine in general. And of course, you're going to get this rush of satisfaction that's going to color your ratings as well, right? So it might be built in that if you finish something, it's going to inflate your perceptions of satisfaction. And on top of that, there's some basic social psychological research to show us that even a little bit of progress on a goal fuels our well-being. And so you accomplishing it pumps you up and you feel this sense.
Good point.
And well-being is partly emotions and partly life satisfaction and partly meaning. We operationalize it in different ways. But another way to turn all this, and maybe you want to go there later, I don't know, but the work of Hal Hirschfield at UCLA about future self. When you started to tell the story about looking at how you're going to feel when you finish something, I thought, yeah, well, now you're doing a bit of time travel. You're thinking about how's future self going to feel when this happens. And I'll just make a simple comment. We can go more on if you want, but thinking about future self is really important because present self will make different choices. And Hal's demonstrated that in his research. I've had some students in the past do research on this as well, that when present self takes into account future self, it increases empathy for future self. It can make a stronger self-continuity between present self and future self. And that self-continuity is really important.
I read about those studies and the various techniques on deathbed regrets or future self having these thought experiments where you're talking to your future self or imagining my future self must be very laid back because he never really he's not helpful. He's just like, yeah, whatever, Larry, I'm good. I'm good. And it never for me, it doesn't have that punch that I keep imagining it would. It's like, okay, let me picture, but I always see myself going, but
there's some great cartoons where future self just hates present self because, future self's going to feel like it. Future self's go, what are you talking about? Right. Because we do see in our research that when we make in this intention, so let's take it over time because I've got a dear colleague, Fuchsia Sirwa at, she was at Sheffield. Where does she go to now? She's in the UK, Durham University in the UK. And she always makes it clear that we have to think about temporal aspects of our being. And that's what procrastination is. It extends over time. These temporal aspects of task performance. So I face a task and I find it aversive. We already defined what that meant. And let's say I'm really frustrated and bored with it. And so I've learned really early in life, if I avoid this task, I can avoid those emotions. And that's the procrastination. So I decide to put it off. Now, the story's not closed yet. The next step typically is that I make an intention update. And sometimes we do it quite literally in a planner. I'll do it Friday morning, or I'll do it tomorrow. It could be more loosely held. I'll do it later, but oftentimes it's quite specific. And what we see is that there's a mood repair. In other words, an increase in our happiness when we put it off because we got rid of the boredom or the resentment. And then when we make the intention update, we also see another uptick in our well-being, our happiness, because now I've got this good intention for the future, right? Look at me. I'm still the good person I think I am. So I don't think we really divorce ourselves that far from future self. Future self's there. We're just dumping on future self.
I like the dumping on future self. That resonates with me because I'm going to put myself in the same position I'm in now, thinking I'll be in a maybe better mood or something is going to change.
Motivated. I think you're going to feel more motivated because your back is against the wall. This is really important part of it. In fact, it's still all about avoidance, which is fascinating. That now what we're doing, when it gets to the 11th hour, now what we're going to avoid is failure, right? We recognize it's do or die. So it's still avoidance motivation. Like before I was avoiding the negative emotions associated with a task. Now I'm avoiding the negative emotions that I can't fail. And so I put in the last minute effort. And we're not working better under pressure, but we just only work under pressure. So that's happening in there too.
You say it's false. I think that some people say I work better under pressure.
Yeah. I can only stretch this so far. Like, whenever we talk about what we know based on research, it's always the most likely story from research done to date. And so just a reporter the other day asked me, has that all this research just been done on students? Has anyone done these on adult samples in the workplace? And unfortunately not. And so there's gaps between our understanding. But I can tell you that there's lab research, experimental research, that when people are put under pressure, they make more errors of omission and commission. We just make more mistakes. And now that's done in experimental settings, which is great epistemologically in terms of demonstrating cause. It's the pressure that is causing the breakdown in performance, but it lacks the feel of real life. So I add that caveat to be fair. But even if you read a book like The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield, who argues that, all writers feel resistance, he doesn't advocate then that, we should be procrastinators. He said the key thing is showing up. And so we don't work better under pressure, he argues. And I've seen the same. I've given public talks. I remember giving one in Toronto, a major Canadian city for American listeners, at the Arts and Letters Club, which is a very old and famous club in the city. And it was important in terms of the venue because it was full of creative people, musicians and artists and writers. And they came up to me afterwards because I was calling procrastination as a gift to our creativity as a myth. And they said, absolutely. And they shared pieces with other books they've read about it, that, the key thing to productivity is showing up and working early. You don't wait for your muse per se, and we don't work better under pressure, but we find that sometimes we only work under pressure. So then the question becomes, well, why does that happen? And if you look at Charles Duhigg, in his wonderful book, The Power of Habit, he writes, we push up against deadlines to build pressure. And the release of pressure is such a powerful reward. And that what we're seeing then is very basic learning theory. We go back to Skinner in many senses, it's so rewarding to release that pressure. And maybe back to Andy Huberman and the fact that, now my dopamine system's just kicked in. And I think, look at me, I'm rocking it. But I would say we've got colored glasses on at that point. And oftentimes when you go back in the cold light of day and look what you've written, you go, oh my God, I thought this was good yesterday, right? So there's a whole bunch of ideas to say that in the laboratory, we see people make more errors of omission and commission. When I talk to people in the real world who are creative people, writers and musicians, they say, The best of us don't just wait till we're working under pressure, although we know it can be a problem in our field as our anxiety holds us back, let's say. But I don't see any evidence that procrastination is a good thing that way.
So I want to get into some of the techniques you feel, and we could do a macro, micro, or I will say what's been helpful for me is just some of the insight as to why I'm procrastinating. Just some of that insight or knowledge is helpful. Now it's in my awareness, and I'll be more attuned to what I'm doing it or why I'm doing it. But as we get into the techniques, I want to talk to you about willpower, or ask you about willpower, because in regards to the role of willpower in managing procrastination, but I wanted to ask your opinion on whether you think it's a limited resource or not, because there was this research back in the day, I think it's 2011 or so, where, and it was a write-up in New York Times. There was this psychological research done, and they named this phenomenon ego depletion, the theory that the willpower is connected to some limited reserve of mental energy or something like that. And once you run out of that energy, you're more likely to lose self-control. Tell me what you know of that and what you think of willpower here.
Okay, well, you summarized that quite well. It is an ego depletion paradigm. Roy Baumeister and his students and colleagues.
That's right.
Many, many studies done on it. And then they became right at the center of a focus on the replication crisis in psychology. But I stand pretty close to Roy, who in the end says that some studies may fail to replicate, but we got to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. That although not every study has been replicated, is the phenomenon real? And I think that when we look at our own lives, you can find a point in the day where you think you've got nothing left, right? You're quote, depleted. Now, there's been like many popular psychological theories, there's almost whole industries built around it. Like the stories of Barack Obama always wearing the same clothes, or Steve Jobs.
That's a big,
have to make any more decisions.
Make small decisions. You're right. Don't
wear yourself out.
Yeah.
Right. So I think when we build anything up too big, it can collapse that way. Now, in that book you're speaking of that I published back in 2013, I did have a short chapter on willpower if I only had the willpower. And I do speak to that ego depletion model because it hadn't come under the same scrutiny at that point. I would back it off a little bit and probably tell readers what you have is that, if there's been controversy around the replication of some of the results. Like I think I even added a point in there about a study that demonstrated that the ingestion of glucose could wipe out the ego depletion effect, not something necessarily that was seen to be replicated. The more important thing, besides saying that, I still think that there's a point in the day where we can feel depleted, that willpower is not the answer. Forcing ourselves will only take us so far. It might help us get over the hump, but I think there's more important strategies that we can use than trying to just become more of a Arnold Schwarzenegger of willpower, right? To pick an old reference that everyone would know, a muscle person of willpower. Yeah. So there's a few ideas there, but you're absolutely right that the ego depletion model is not as simple as was once said. I would be careful not to say that there's nothing to do with self-control and willpower in human beings' lives. I just wouldn't rest my hopes on it. And instead I would say, okay, I told you the study about experience sampling and the students finally getting down to the task and saying, it's not as bad as I thought. And I wish I'd started earlier. So way back in the 90s, then my whole mantra became just get started, not just do it, not the Nike slogan, which is a great slogan, but just doing it can be overwhelming. So I said, no, let's just get started because that seems to be the precipitous moment. Now, as we talked before we got going on the podcast, back in 2006, I had a podcast and I did it for quite a while. So I was quite a public intellectual in that sense. And people would write to me and they still do. And I remember one person saying, Dr. Pychyl, it's so nice that you've shared all this research with us. And I respect that you've been doing research for all this time. But really, sir, if I could just get started, I wouldn't have a procrastination problem. Could you do a little bit better than that, please? So, I was kind of like every academic, stuck in my data and stuck in my own constructs. And so I went outside of that a bit to a person I've mentioned already, David Allen, productivity guru. And David, amongst the many wise things he says, we don't really do projects, we do actions. And so my personal mantra, because you said you wanted to talk a little bit about strategies, mine is when I face a task that I don't want to do, rather than rely on willpower, because that's where this began, I would say, Tim, what's the next action? And oftentimes I'll actually play it out in my head like this. Larry, I'll say, Tim, what's the next action you'd take on this task if you were going to do it, even though I know you don't want to do it? I know your whole being saying, I don't want to do it. And that's just being honest with myself. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute too. And that what's the next action has to be as simple as possible. In fact, there's some fascinating research in psychology that shows that if we think about things concretely, they seem to belong to the present. They almost have a sense of urgency to them. When we think about things abstractly, just the way our brains work, they seem to belong to tomorrow. No sense of urgency. So make it concrete, make it small, make it so small that you realize, oh, I can do that. So I can certainly open my email and see what it is Larry wants to talk about. I can do that right now. I don't want to plan an interview with Larry. I just don't want to do that, but I'll go read his email. Just keep it small. Because see, then what has to happen is I just got started. I didn't leave. And the other thing is now I've taken my focus off of how I'm feeling about it, and I'm actually thinking about how I'm going to do it. That can be quite magical. On certain days, it's like priming the pump at the cottage, where you have to get water in the pipe first. It catches and you've got water. Other days, I'm embarrassed to say, I might have to do that 100 times. Now, I say I'm embarrassed to say it because it seems so pathetic. But at the end of the day, I hold my head up high and say, look what I got done. I didn't want to do any of it, but I got her done. And that is a great feeling. That is a really key strategy. And it didn't rely on willpower. In a sense, it did just the opposite. I said, I'm going to make this so tiny. My next step is so tiny that there's no way I can say I can't do that. And now I've started and I'm okay. The article I'm referring to was published in Psychological Science back in 2008. The title of it is Construal Level in Procrastination, co-authored by 4 psychologists, McCrae, Lieberman, Trope, and Sherman. And fascinating. It was 3 studies put together showing different ways of making things concrete versus abstract in their construal. One of them even involved abstract art. And in each case, the more we construe things concretely, the more they seem to belong to today, the more that you're more likely to act on them. So there's some quirks, famous book, Nudge. We've got the Nobel Prize winning Richard Taylor, who's taught us so much about how we're predictably irrational. We're more like Homer Simpson than Homo economicus. And in a sense now, it's nudging us. It's showing that how we're going to use the fact that this is what the human brain is like, right? We know, for example, the human brain is really sensitive to negatives. We know the human brain, in this case, if we phrase things concretely, we're more likely to act on them. So that's what I was saying specifically. When you invited Oliver Burkeman on your podcast, I think the title was Life is Short, To-Do Lists Are Long.
Yeah.
And to-do lists have a double-edged sword. I'm much more likely to use my calendar and embed things contextually rather than just have this big growing list of things that I can do, because that's overwhelming. Whereas if I think about things in relation to how much time I really have and when I'd actually do it, sometimes then it allows me to use the magic word, nope, not happening. So, a very subtle strategy, but to-do lists can be deadly. Now, trust me, I still use a to-do list, but it's for a different purpose than it's managing things in the background.
So you're doing some form of time blocking or recommending in the calendar. Yeah.
I use half-hour blocks. It's funny, I was listening to Sam Harris the other day, and he said something like, I couldn't tell you what I was doing this day in 2011. And I thought, I could, because I can go back 20 years and tell you what I was doing.
Curious as to your time blocking technique. When you put it in the calendar, is it a general category like writing or studying, or is it the specific to do?
Good question. It's usually the specific to do. Like I would, especially when I was struggling to get some stuff done, I'd say read 5 pages of that article. Some articles are so hard to read, right? Because there's so many bright people out there that are so much smarter. I have to struggle to understand them. So I'd put in, read 5 pages, right? So I'd make it small. I'd make it attainable. Now, it's a work in progress. Like I'm planning, I'm updating, I'm using wisdom to know, is this an intention update or a procrastination? I'm doing that self-examination. But it's a living document. And for those people who are reacting to this saying, I don't know how you could be so anally retentive, to use a Freudian expression, how can you be so uptight? In fact, my schedule is so freeing because I keep things done. I can be more spontaneous because I know I'm on top of things. I don't have to exert a lot of effort trying to remember anything because it's all in there. And I could look back and celebrate my day and say, wow, like this is the person you are. And I can also look at it, kind of forensic audit, and say, Tim, where's your life going here? Like, show me where your recreation time is this week. Like, what's happening to your life?
So are you keeping a separate to-do list and then just moving them over, or then just creating a calendar event from a to-do list? Or are you just looking at a blank calendar and then filling it in? I hope you understand the question.
I do. 90% of the time I'm working just with my calendar, and there's repeating events. Our days have structures, scripts and schemas. I've got my getting up routine, and I still have some teens at home that I take care of and feed and all those wonderful things. And so I've got all those, the recurring events, feed the horses, feed the dogs. And then I'm plopping in the other stuff. And sometimes they're tentative blocks. Sometimes they're held religiously, to use a phrase. I wouldn't let that slide. Now, my to-do list, this is just me personally. There's no research to back this one up. I'm just telling you what I do. It's for those things where I'm walking around the farm and say, yeah, I got to change the oil in the tractor sometime soon. So I just dump that into the to-do list just so I don't have to think about it anymore, right? I don't have to think, I got to remember to change the oil. I just dump it in the to-do list. And I in the morning, usually I have a cup of coffee. I like a cup of coffee in the morning. I like quiet time in the morning. I'll flip through that in relation to my week and just do a little bit of planning and say, am I going to move anything? Your question. Am I going to move something now from my to-do list into a schedulable act? So it's a really important dance. Now, because our topic is procrastination, I want to emphasize something to listeners. I constantly argue this. That kind of scheduling and time management is necessary, but not sufficient. Because you can develop some wicked scheme for keeping track of stuff. And then it comes time where it says, if I use just a general block term, deep work, as some of these people will use, I look at that, or exercise, even better for some of us. My whole body wants to run away, right? That's why time management isn't the problem with procrastination. Then I have to face myself in a different way. So if I could, Larry, just let me add one more thing, that because we were talking about strategies, and I gave you one, which is what's the next action. Still wouldn't take that off the table as base, but the absolute heart of procrastinating less, I liked how you say it, avoiding procrastination. Let's go like avoiding. To procrastinate less is to develop some emotion regulation skills. This is crucial. The reason we procrastinate, I argue, what we've seen in our research, and I go back to people like Roy Baumeister and Diane Tice and others, and Ellen Bratlaski, and there's a whole line of people who've done self-regulation research. And I stand on their shoulders in saying these things, is that it's a self-regulation failure. It's actually a misregulation. We actually believe that avoidance is going to make us feel better. It's a bit like believing that eating that second row of cookies in the bag is going to feel better, or buying those new shoes when I don't have the money is going to make me feel better. Those things aren't true. That's a misregulation.
It's a false prediction. Yeah.
Yeah. And procrastination is just that, a false prediction that me not doing this work today, I'm going to feel more like it tomorrow, and I'm going to feel better today, and neither is true. So what we need to do, and this is where I would hang my whole hat with how can I procrastinate less? We have to develop a mindful approach to dealing with our emotions. That means I have to become non-judgmentally aware of my emotions that I'm having. What's going on here? Why don't I want to do this? Why am I not jumping into it? And if I say, well, I'm really anxious about this, or I'm resentful this is on my desk at all, or this is the most boring thing in the world. I'm using these over and over again because we see them in our research, but there's other negative emotions it could be. Then I have to allow that in a very mindful approach. You just experience the emotion. Don't try to analyze it intellectually. Just allow it. And for the most part, you realize that most of the time it disappears. But more than that, what I hear echo in my mind at that point is Joseph Goldstein's wonderful words. It's okay to feel this way. It's only human to feel bored or resentful or anxious. It's okay to feel this way. So if you were in my head during the day, Larry, and watching me try to get things done like any other human being, you'd see me say, what's the next action? It's okay to feel this way, Tim. And between those two, I keep moving forward, right? And in the background, I'm scheduling and living up to my intentions, but it's my emotion regulation that's so crucial. And so I really want that to be driven home, that if you want to reduce your procrastination, you have to start to come into touch with emotions that are often non-conscious. You're just reacting to the task at hand and leaving. Become non-judgmentally aware of those emotions and know that you can move forward despite those emotions. The Buddhists put this as, we're not our thoughts. We have all sorts of crazy thoughts. Just think of the things that you and I have thought about while we're ostensibly talking still with each other. All sorts of things, right? Minds are a busy place. That's what they do. They think and feel, think and feel, think and feel. We can't take that too seriously. Instead, we say, okay, what's the next action?
Let me ask you this. Emotional regulation, is it helpful or harmful? Because I read kind of a sentence here and there or thread through your writings on the topic about staying put. Don't move, stay there, get it done, or I'm paraphrasing here. But I occasionally, when there's a task that I don't want to do, I need to do, and I'm kind of dreading it, I'll get ready to do it. I know that I'm finishing one thing. Now I'm heading toward this thing that I put off, but it's not a fun task, or it's going to be a little work. I will get up. I'll take a break. I'll get up and I'll just walk around. This is kind of my coping strategy. And I'm just trying to reset my mind. I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm walking around. I am postponing. I'm doing a micro kind of postponement thing. Am I making it worse? It feels like it's helping. Is it self-defeating?
Yeah. I loved basketball when I was in high school, and we used to do free throw shots at lunchtime. So you go to the foul line and you'd shoot hoops. And everyone had their own little ritual before you'd shoot the hoop, double dribble or something.
I was a basketball player, so yeah.
Okay. So, and you can pick many sports. You watch people serve too.
Serving. Let's talk about tennis. I'm a big tennis player. So okay, I just played last night. I'll look at my strings. I'll walk around a little bit.
So, and then you serve. And that's what the kind of image I got with you. You're at your desk and you're ready. You got everything arranged, and then you get all this energy and you get up and you walk around a little bit. And is it bad? No, of course it's not bad. Do I think it could go away? Yeah, I do. And I think if I was your coach in the tennis court, if it was too elaborate, I'd say, what are you doing? Right? Because some of it
it's like Djokovic. If I do the 25 bounces.
Yeah, because it's superstitious conditioning. Go way back to the 70s. When Skinner and Skinnerian operant conditioning was the focus, we actually had this thing called superstitious conditioning, where we would watch animals engage in behaviors that weren't taught in relation to getting a reinforcer. In fact, that actually broke down. We could see most of them were repetitive behaviors. They had a lot to do with food. But we can do a lot of things in our lives that are kind of spooky little habits that just, it's just what we do. Now, I think when we get more in touch with our feelings, some of those things disappear. But is it bad? No. Are you getting back on task? Yes. Could you eliminate it? Probably. Do you have to? No. Again, I've worked with professionals and they'll say, Tim, is it bad that I'll have a bunch of tasks in front of me and I'll do a couple of the easy ones first to get some momentum up and then get into the big one?
Well, that's a good question.
Is it bad? Yeah, well, that's what I'm throwing out there because it has a lot of the same flavor. And first of all, I'm never going to say something is good or bad because we don't even do that with our research. Is it necessary or unnecessary? We don't even have data to answer that. But I would say if that strategy works for you, good on you. It's like stretching before a run, let's say.
Okay.
As long as you get into the hard stuff. But I can tell you, I have a memorable day where
because I've heard people say, do the hard thing first. That's like a thing.
Including Viktor Frankl. Right? In his autobiography, he devoted a page and a half to really procrastination. And I thought, this is crazy. Like Viktor Frankl has so much more important things to write about, you'd think. But he wrote things like, since my days in the concentration camp, I learned to do the more difficult stuff first. And I thought, wow, like this is the kind of stuff you're sharing. Yeah, it's pretty deep wisdom, actually.
So it is, you've discovered this
in his writing.
It is right, but is it something you discovered in your research that is helpful to get things done? Should someone do the hard things first?
I don't have a research-based answer for that. I don't have data that way,
worries.
But I'd go back to your ego depletion discussion and say that, yeah, I think we all know that we should be using those parts of the day when we are functioning on all cylinders to get the tough stuff done and not wait to the point where we do feel depleted, notwithstanding our discussion of the fact there is a replication issue. I know you talked to Lisa Feldman Barrett, and I think she might have lots of interesting things to say about our emotions and our.
That's why I mentioned the predictive
moments,
aspects of the constructed
that's
emotion.
What her brain's doing. Yes, exactly. She does that so well and teaches us that so well.
So I want to talk about motivation. And by the way, when I talked to Pierce, we didn't spend so much time on procrastination as the motivation aspect of the problem or the solution, as it may be here. Is procrastination a motivation problem in any way?
Well, it's a tough question because you said in any way, because of course, motivation is going to have something to do with everything, right? That, and we could be reductionistic about it and talk about, well, what's the role of dopamine in motivation then? And where are we getting a spike of dopamine? And the answer is motivation matters, of course. Now, is procrastination a motivation problem? And that's where I say no. Because, at this point, for someone who's procrastinated, they've said, I have an intention to do something and I know why I want to do it. And in fact, it's really important to me. But when it comes time to it, I put it off. I avoid it. And you can think of your example you gave me with the event you might want to hold, notwithstanding I can't unpack that further until I knew you better. We can have motivation and still procrastinate. We can have effective time management and still procrastinate. So I think the problem for me with framing it that way is that procrastination is not a motivation problem. It's a problem with self-regulation failure. And Pierce actually has framed it like that since back when he did his own doctoral dissertation. He's one of the first people to say the I think his meta-analysis was even titled that, quintessential self-regulation failure. That's what's going on here. So then I have to poke at that beast and go, what's failing? Well, I don't think it's the motivation that's failing. If I increase my motivation, could it decrease my procrastination? Yes, I believe so. Is it a panacea? If I just increase that, would it help? Would it solve the problem? No, because there's other things psychologically, intrapsychically particularly, whether that be guilt or shame or boredom or frustration or resentment, that we have to deal with. And in fact, I want to add, because we've been at this a long time and I know we're going to wrap it up fairly soon, is that when I talked about guilt and shame in passing there, I want to add that self-compassion is really important. And we learned in one of our studies that self-forgiveness, surprisingly, was even really important. That if we didn't forgive ourselves, we're more likely to procrastinate. And when I asked my co-author, who really designed the study, to explain that to me, because I didn't expect it, he said, well, Tim, procrastination is a transgression against the self. Imagine you had a transgression against someone else, like Larry. You said something offensive to him. What would be the motivation? Well, it'd be avoid. I'd avoid Larry, and he'd avoid me. Yeah, but what if Larry forgave you and realized you're just an idiot? What would be the motivation then? Well, it would be approach. He goes, yeah, okay. Now with procrastination, the transgression is against the self, and unless you forgive yourself, you're going to want to avoid. So it just adds another layer of what procrastination already is. So I want to put that on the table too in our thoughts about procrastination, that I could have all the motivation in the world and not get something done. And then I start beating myself up with guilt because of what I didn't do. And if I do it long enough, then I start to feel shame, like I'm such a procrastinator. And those are just going to undermine you more. And so again, accepting your common humanity and toning it down a little bit and saying, it's okay to feel this way. You are only human. And, then we get into things that we do learn through cognitive behavioral therapy and all that negative self-talk. That's another big story, but I didn't want to put it on the table.
No. So I like it. And the reason I brought up motivation is because you You have some mantras where I really like in your book. One of them, I think, is my current motivational state does not need to match my intention in order to act. I like that
Yeah,
a lot.
it's huge. But you had the guy on your podcast already. He's a writer, and what's his name? He writes about motivation. He's really coined that quite well. That our motivational state doesn't have to match the task at hand. Yeah, this is a big, interesting thing for me. I wonder, where did we start believing this in life, that I have to feel like it? I told you in passing that I've still got some teens. As much as I'm retired, I'm 68 this year. I'm a dinosaur dad. I had kids late in life. There's a procrastination for you. And
I got married at 50, by the way.
oh, good for you. Yeah. So I had my first kid. I was in my 50th year, and I'm glad I did. I'll say to them, it's time to clean your room. I don't feel like it. Say, I didn't ask you how you felt. Did you notice that? I didn't say, hey, do you feel like cleaning your room? And it's interesting how we do that even to ourselves. Adults will say, I don't feel like it. Who feels like cleaning the kitchen right now? Nobody. But I even have to have that internal dialogue more times than I want to tell you. And I think, Tim, no one feels like this right now. Just do it. And I kind of do what you do, Larry. I look at, how am I going to feel when that's done? And then now I know I'm smart enough to realize 10, I'm going to feel that's really important to me in the end. Just get over the hump. And I bring out all the guns, right? If you think of them that way, or every tool out of the toolkit, because I know you use that metaphor. Then I say, okay, what's the next action? And it's okay to feel this way. Like, it's incredible how they all dance together, and they're all just at hand, all these tools. They really are powerful, tiny little things that I'm doing that just keep me being the person that I want to be. Or, as you say so well on your website, overcoming obstacles. These obstacles are so flippin' mundane, right? Like, I don't feel like doing the dishes, but I know that if I had my tidy kitchen, I would just feel better. And, after you've done it a while, dishes or whatever, you realize it actually doesn't take very long at all. It's crazy how short it takes to even do a very thorough clean of your kitchen. And you just keep extending that to that garage you never get to, or to that basement, and da 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 da.
Wow.
I just love that.
I saw that you wrote a paper on procrastination and depression. Is there a correlation between procrastination and depression?
Yeah, there is. Now, so you got two variables, and they're related to each other: procrastination and depression. They're measured variables. If you measure a third variable, self-regulation failure, it can take that correlation and make it zero, because there's this third intervening variable. They're related to each other because both are related to a breakdown in self-regulation. So that's, on one hand, that's what's happening. On the other hand, if you procrastinate all the time, you can develop regret and shame that can contribute to depression. On the other hand, what we find is that both procrastinators and people who are depressed ruminate a great deal. So rumination is that constantly thinking negative thoughts, particularly. So are they related? Yes. They're related to a common third factor, self-regulation failure, but they're intimately danced together for other reasons too, that procrastination can contribute to depression, and that other intrapsychic processes like rumination can contribute to both of them. So it's a very complex thing. But we know that people who procrastinate all the time and don't want to are pretty unhappy people.
Is there anything that I should or we should have mentioned that I didn't get to or ask as we wrap this up that's important to dealing with procrastination?
There's two things, since you've asked, and since we're only ever going to probably talk once, Larry, as much as I kind of like you. My friend at Utrecht University, Joel Anderson, wrote a wonderful chapter with Joe Heath from the University of Toronto. Joe Heath is worth getting to know just because he's such a great philosopher. But they wrote a chapter in a book called The Thief of Time: Philosophical Essays About Procrastination. And it's a wonderful little chapter about extended will. And we haven't talked about the fact, we talked about willpower, but we could have probably inserted this here. They give this example. Joel had to explain this to me. I said, what's extended will, Joel? He said, well, if I asked you, Tim, what's 3 times 3, you'd say 9. What's 268 times 3,474? I can't even remember the numbers, Joel. He said, yeah, but if I gave you a calculator or paper and pencil, you could do it, right? Absolutely. He said, we call that extended cognition. We use tools in the world to be able to think more. why is it that we think willpower has to be an internal resource? And that was kind of implicit in your question about willpower. So they argue that we need to outsource our willpower. And we can do that using our social environment, our physical environment. It's called extended will, outsourcing our will. And I'll give you a couple of simple examples. If we think about how difficult it is in a world full of things like phones, mine's on airplane mode right now, I could just hide my phone, for goodness sakes. And if I can't do it on my own, I can give it to my son. I could give it to my son. He's really good at this. Alex, keep my phone for an hour, just like the story of the sirens and tying myself to the mast, that I say, Alex, take my phone. Doesn't matter how much I want it back, you keep it. And now I've outsourced some of my willpower. Or I enlist a friend, exercise. At the end of the day, I could say I'm too tired to exercise, but Larry, if I said I was going to go for a run with you, I'd never let you down. It's just something I know about my nature. I'll be there, I promise, Larry. And so we can use other people. We could use what's really called a commitment device, a pre-commitment device. My good self, when I'm feeling strong, makes a commitment to something and pre-commits me. And so I want people to think about that too. We can always leverage our willpower because we have some, and we have some self-control. Leverage that self-control to help you do the things you find more difficult to do. So that's one thing that I wanted to add to our conversation. And the other thing is a gift that was given to us by Peter Gallwitzer and his colleagues called implementation intentions. And I write a lot about it in the book because I think it's another powerful tool. And in a nutshell, this is it. I can have a goal intention, go vacuum the pool. And I think of that because that's what I'm going to do right after we finish talking, because it's right next to, I have a little farm and the pool gets very dirty. So my goal is to vacuum the pool, but the implementation intention is in situation X, I'm going to do behavior Y. When I end my talking on Zoom with Larry, then I'm going to assemble the vacuum. Now, notice I've actually already put in there something very concrete, and it's an if-then. So if-then yourself to death. When I finish doing this, then I'm going to do that. Why? Because it puts the stimulus for action into the environment. It gets us off of autopilot. Otherwise, we just do what we typically do at whatever time of day it is. But if I can put something in the environment that says, oh yeah, what was I going to do then? It can help us establish new habits, because habits are really important. We don't, and I know you've talked about habits too on your podcast. So we don't have to make everything so arduous. If we can develop implementation intentions, if we can outsource our will, it doesn't always have to be this exertion of sheer effort. Yeah. So those are two things I wanted to add.
That's very interesting because I found I work out of the house, but 3 days a week, I've recently signed up for a work share office that a friend of mine and I, we are working on our separate projects. We'll come together. We'll meet at this office, and we may not interact during the day, but we're just the fact that we're sharing a space and we're working the same space. I get more done. There's something about going location A to location B, and that in between time puts me in a focus mode. I'm going to go to this location in this environment. I got X amount of time. I'm going to do these things. So just going to a different environment, one, and the other is being with someone else as they're working on something has helped me.
Yeah. So social psychologists taught us that back in the early 1900s, there was a social facilitation effect. So being with others increases. We don't get the social loafing. We feed on each other. And then the other part is that once you establish this routine, you do pre-writing. Like writers will tell you this, that as you get this establishment, then as you're traveling there, you're starting to think about what you're doing and all this non-conscious work it's really part of the work. So yeah, bravo. And writers do this all the time. Thesis groups in universities, for example. New professors who are struggling to write, just get together and write. They might not even talk to each other, as you say, but the fact that they showed up and they wrote together, very powerful.
The other was just for the if-then, because I've heard that before, and I get it, but just wondering the implementation. Is that something you recommend somebody write down during the day, or just it's a form of mindfulness, or is it?
Actually, it's going to keep it at the level of technique. And for your listeners, they could go to Whoop. Like, just use your search engine and look up WOOP, because Peter Gallwitzer has worked with his partner Gabrielle Ottingen. I think I'm saying her last name correctly. I've never met Gabrielle. And she's taken something that in psychology we call mental contrasting with implementation intentions and simplified it into this thing called WOOP. And WOOP stands for wish, outcome, obstacle, and plan. So what's your wish? I'm going to give you an example I use all the time, but was so powerful for me. I wish I flossed my teeth every day. I do now. I'll tell you that right off the bat. What's the outcome? Then I wouldn't have the beginnings of gum disease and my dentist would quit yelling at me. What's the obstacle? I can never remember to do it and I resent it when I do. What's your plan? And my plan was a simple one. I had a habit of brushing my teeth. When I pick up my toothbrush, I'll put the floss on the counter. When I put down my toothbrush, I'll pick up the floss. Then it became established as a habit. But you know what? I still faced inner obstacles. So I'd remember, picking up my toothbrush, put the floss on the counter. I'd be putting down my toothbrush thinking, I don't want to. I don't feel like it. I'm like a 6-year-old, right? It takes too long. It doesn't take long at all to floss your teeth, even more thoroughly than your dental hygienist does, for goodness sakes, right? It doesn't take long. So I'd have to get all past all that. Tim, what's the next action? Break off a piece of floss and put it in your mouth, for goodness sakes, right? Anyhow, that's really, I hope, a memorable example of how you can take something you already do in your day and harness something else to it and develop some wickedly good habits. Early research by Gallwitzer and his colleagues showed that women who were told to do self-breast exams, just told that it was important for them to do, very few did it. Those who made an implementation intention went way up in terms of the uptake of doing those breast exams, particularly if they took context into account. So, for example, when I'm getting out of the shower, when I'm already touching myself with a towel, that's a good time to do a breast exam. Just like I wouldn't say I'm going to floss my teeth after I watch television. I'm already in the bathroom with my toothbrush, makes more sense then. Mm-hmm. So implementation intentions have a lot of power. You can't apply them to everything. You need to be strategic. But I remember doing workshops.
And context is important. Yeah. Sorry.
Yes. And I've done workshops for people and they'll make an implementation intention when I leave the workshop then. And then I'll get emails later going, I did it. Like I had a task that I wasn't doing forever. And I simply made the implementation intention and made it concrete and asked myself, what's the next action? And bang, there I'm on my game.
Where can people find you now? I know you've retired from teaching. So give us your main source where people can find you now.
Well, back in the 90s, as the web was emerging, I got the domain name procrastination.ca. And I've kept that. It was a research group site for a long time, but now I no longer do research. I'm no longer employed by the university. And so now I'm transitioning to just a place where people can go to get resources to help with procrastination. So this interview will be there. The stuff that I've done for the Waking Up app is there, a link to that, other podcasts, and as well as a blog that I did for Psychology Today. So those sorts of resources are there. But in that sense, people aren't going to find me because I'm not active the same way anymore. Okay. But I'm going to contribute over the next few years, at least, to trying to tell the story of what we know from research to date, and then watch that get handed off to wonderful colleagues like Fuchsia Sirwa, who I mentioned at Durham University, who's leading the way in lots of this research now.
Man, you really showed up, and I could see why you won all those awards for teaching. You are connected, you are engaged, and I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, well, thanks. That means a lot. Yeah, well, we're going to spend an hour and a half of our lives together. It's got to be meaningful, or what the heck are we doing, right? That's an hour and a half I can't get back, and neither can you.
Well, that's a wrap. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed it, do share it with your friends and on your social platforms. Big thanks to Sam Williams, my audio guy, and the beautiful bumper music you're hearing is Michael Petrovich's Bella Luna. For all my show notes or resource links, visit LarryWeeks.com, and we will talk again soon.